Well, actually, oh. All right, I guess we'll get going then. So how many people do we got? Okay. So, to any of you who may have joined the church since I left or just don't know me very well, I sincerely apologize for how weird this is going to be because I do not do things normally very often. So, how did I get myself into this mess anyways? The perfectly honest answer is that October, not last year, the year before, someone asked me if I'd go with them, and I promptly ignored that because I wouldn't have been going for the right reasons at that point. Fast forward about 6 months, I was driving up the on-ramp at exit 167 in St. Cloud, leaving for my route that day, and God took a hold of my arm and kind of went like this and went, "Daniel, are you ready to listen now?" And no, I wasn't ready to listen, but I knew it was him speaking, and I knew what he was asking for. And he was asking for one of the simplest things there is: obedience. That's all he asked for. He didn't give me any more details. All he asked was that I would let go of my plan and do what he wanted instead. And over the next couple months, every worldly concern I had was taken care of and provided for in ways that could only be explained by divine intervention. Between work, finances for the schooling, cleaning up any debt I had, and providing for every little detail imaginable, God did basically everything that he could do other than physically picking me up from home and dropping me off in Eden Prairie. I knew it was God, I just didn't know what he was doing, and that was terrifying. So on September 27th, I showed up at the base, scared out of my mind of what I was doing. Everything familiar was already gone, and God had sent me to the last place I ever would have put myself in. The first few weeks of lecture phase were a lot of major adjustments, new people, new environment, going from living in the middle of nowhere to being in a suburb, stepping away from a labor-intensive job and sitting in a classroom. That was fun. Everything about my existence was pretty much just turned on its head. And throughout the classroom portion, God spent a lot of time chipping away at me. There were a lot of days where it felt more like he was constantly tearing off pieces instead of chipping away bit by bit. But I suppose that if that much needed to go, then I guess it's good to have it all gone. The entire time I was there, I felt out of place. I didn't think I belonged there. I didn't feel useful. I didn't think I was wanted. But little did I know that part of the plan was to show me how wrong I was. But we'll get to that when we get to it. One of the primary things I was concerned about was losing people while I was gone. Several people I'm very close to were in fairly poor health, and I was quite concerned that while I was away, people would pass when I couldn't be there or couldn't get home or anything like that, and I wouldn't have the chance to say goodbye. In the 6th week of the 13-week lecture phase, I got a message from home just saying my grandmother had been sent to the hospital and they were very concerned about her. And we'd known that that was coming, but we didn't know when. I believe she did go home that night, but a part of me knew this was the beginning of the end and I was going to lose her. I wrote a prayer request to send to the group, and as I started to reflect on the role she'd played in my life, that was when I finally broke. I don't know why, but for some reason, crying is a very uncommon response to anything for me. Not sure if you would guess that looking at me, but it just doesn't happen very often. And there's years between the times that I would actually shed a tear. And sitting in the back of the van that night, I cried for about half an hour straight without letting anyone notice. And I'd seen the reality of death before, but it had never come this close to home. And I spent several weekends at home, and I was able to ensure that I was there for every moment I could be. But every time I left, I knew I would never see her that way again. As she slowly slipped away, when I came home, it wasn't the person I knew anymore. It wasn't the person I'd seen last time I was there. She could still speak, she could still communicate a little bit, but day by day, it wasn't necessarily watching her fade, but just seeing the steps as I would leave for a week or two, come back, and then the sudden drop was very hard to watch. At the end of the lecture phase, I went home for Christmas break, feeling like I'd been completely dismantled without a single piece of me being put back together yet. I was kind of in shambles, and the only thread I had left to hang on by was the fact that I knew I was where God wanted me and doing what he asked of me, even if I didn't have a clue what the point was. And while I don't remember what I said to people while I was home when they asked about it, I kind of faked a smile and said that everything would be okay, even though I know nothing was okay at that point. I knew this was part of the plan. I didn't know the rest of the plan, but I knew I was following what I was supposed to. And that's all I had to hang on to. And the family came together for the holidays and made it as normal as we could. Grammy was there, but she couldn't respond anymore. It was very important to my grandfather that she was there for one last Christmas with us, and she had her place in the family circle just like any other year. On December 27th, just after 4 o'clock, she went to heaven, and the importance of the birth we had just celebrated became very real to all of us. One point that did come up in all of this was the original scheduled leave date for the outreach was New Year's Day was a Saturday. We were supposed to come back to the base January 2nd. Then Monday or Tuesday, we were going to fly out. However, trying to fly home immediately after, well, not fly home, but fly immediately after the holidays, turned out waiting a week saved us about $8,000 on airfare. So we did a week of local outreach in Minneapolis, which also was complicated because a couple of our leaders had one of their kids get COVID. So that would have thrown a wrench in leaving on the 2nd anyways. But with that, since we were home that week, I was still able to be home for her funeral and be there for my family and everything, and be with them when we all needed each other. So while it may have seemed like an inconvenience initially to change the dates and everything, it turned out to be another instance of God's providence at work. And I didn't read that. I mixed up my points. Perfect. So, after God handled all the little details just as much as the big ones, we can move on to ministry details. We were based out of the city of Uruapan. It's about 200 miles straight west of Mexico City. And we stayed with a missionary family there who started with the Minneapolis YWAM base, and they've been there for a couple years now. The group we were working with is called the Purepecha people. They are the last well, I'm not sure if it's the last, but they're one of the last surviving native Mexican cultures. And they're the one group that the Spanish never managed to conquer. So the native culture is very much preserved and still alive in that area. And we were, well, like most of them, their kids don't speak Spanish because they haven't been in school for the last couple of years. It's kind of separate from the rest of the Mexican culture. It was a very interesting thing to see kind of the city where it's what you would, well, not necessarily what you would expect, but what you would think of as the Mexican culture, Spanish speaking, and then driving 25 minutes up the mountain and seeing something completely different. Our 6 weeks out, Our 6-week outreach ended up falling into about 3 smaller sections. Our overall goal was to expand the ministry that Jamie and Edgar had already started. And the first thing we did was to help with a children's ministry out in a fairly remote village called Santa Rosa. One thing I should bring up is that the Purepecha people they feel like they've been very misrepresented in the media and everything, so it's very difficult to take pictures and stuff like that in a respectful manner. So I don't have anything to share with you guys because of that. You're just gonna have to trust me. The scenery was beautiful, that close to the equator in January and February. That was just a shame that I had to miss all the below zero. I was really torn up about that one. But the area Santa Rosa was in does not have an established church. It's about 2 hours away from the church we were working with. And the only reason we were able to go is because we had tribal elders with us from the village we were working in. They are relatively close to the gospel. Like, we could never walk in and minister there on our own. But since the elders from the other village brought us, we were able to basically work under the respect that they had for those elders, and they were willing to let us come in and do our work because of that. So the basic format of that ministry was basically we would show up and all the children would flock to the basketball court we were setting up at, and we'd spend about probably 15 minutes or half an hour going through some kind of biblical lesson with them. And after that, it was simply spending time with the kids, playing games with them, stuff like that. They're not very established in this village yet, so most of that was just building the reputation of them actually wanting to help and be there for the right reasons, so that hopefully they can come back at a later time and be able to share more openly. One of the things we did while we were there was one of the other missionaries that they work with has started an archery club there. Basically just because he found a sport that could use very cheap materials and set up something that's actually useful for them. And they've spent the last couple years teaching a bunch of kids in several different villages how to shoot. And generally, the children in the villages are known for being rather violent and unpredictable. So, of course, the obvious thing to do is give them weapons. But somehow we did that, and they were willing to listen and take directions and respect what they were doing. And while I was only there for a couple whole days where we just set it up out in that village for the first time, What that archery club has done is it's given the missionary and the local person that he's working with an opportunity to model a godly role model to children that would never see it in their home or anywhere else in the village. So even though they're not able to openly share the gospel and share why they're doing what they're doing, it's providing credibility to the message that they hope to eventually be able to share. The times we went to Santa Rosa in the first week, generally there were about 80 people there in a village of 300, and they would start dwindling after a couple hours. The second week, though, we showed up and suddenly it dropped down to about 50, which I learned was the result of them figuring out we weren't there to give them anything. And plain and simple, a lot of them just weren't interested in showing up if there wasn't free stuff involved. Initially, it was sad to see it drop like that, but the one thing I did notice was that after that, the kids that were still there were much more attentive and interested in listening. So I believe it was a lot more fruitful for the ones who did come, even if we didn't necessarily have the higher numbers that we had seen the first few days. Time, it's irrelevant too. It's something like that, but and the last day we were there, we were able to actually give them something, but Jamie and Edgar have worked with Samaritan's Purse for the last couple of years, and we were able to just give them Christmas presents that they never would have gotten from anywhere else. And it was really interesting to see how something so small meant so much to them. That was a very eye-opening thing for us. That day was a Friday. It was the end of the second week of our outreach. And the next day, we went to the village of Angowan for a VBS and to begin planning for what would turn out to be the next 2 weeks of our outreach. The pastor and his family let us stay at the church for that first week, and most of our time was spent doing home visits and working on a ceiling for their sanctuary. One of the things that I was able to share in those times came from Colossians 3 and Isaiah 60 about how our earthly work has eternal significance. A lot of them in that area, the first example I think of was a guy whose entire family just made bricks, which you can probably imagine how day after day making brick after brick, that would just feel like a chore that doesn't mean anything. But if we look at those verses, the Colossians passage, chapter 3, verses 23 and 24, which says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." And Isaiah chapter 60, verse 9, "For the coastland shall hope for me, the ships of Tarshish first, to bring your children from afar, their silver and gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has made you beautiful." So that Colossians passage is very straightforward. Work for the Lord, not for men, because he's the one you'll receive your reward from. A lot of times we don't really think about what we're doing as working for the Lord if we're not actively doing ministry. But when we think about it, if we go back to what I started talking about during the sermon this morning, every action we take reflects back on God, and it can glorify him. So there may not ever be anyone who recognizes the person we were talking to in the village for the quality of his bricks. But God is watching, and he sees the work that he puts into it. And God recognizes that, and it matters way more than just making a brick that's nice and square. And then the Isaiah passage, it's not so immediately apparent, but there's one line in there that really sticks out. "The ships of Tarshish first." Now, as far as we know, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Tarshish was not a Christian city. They were not known to be believers. But in this passage in Isaiah, it's talking about the New Jerusalem and the glory of that city as God recreates it. And the ships of Tarshish are there, even though those people most likely were not believers. their work still brought glory to God and is still recognized by him as being something really incredible, to the point that he's putting it in the New Jerusalem. And when we think about that, our work takes on a lot more meaning than just making bricks, putting windows in, filing people's taxes. Doing it right and doing it well matters because, for one thing, it does reflect on God how we work in this life. And he recognizes our efforts. And when we work in a way that honors him, there's very good reason to believe that he will put that in the next life too. So, another interesting thing about the village in Angowan is that it sits right next to the most newly formed volcano in the world. Back in the 1940s, a man was standing out in his cornfield and smoke started coming out of the ground. And eventually there was some lava bubbling up, and 3 days later there was a mountain there that wasn't there before. The lava flow was slow enough that everyone evacuated. No one was hurt or killed, but the new mountain that it built leveled a village. However, the lava flow stopped at the wall of a Catholic church that had a crucifix on the other side. Now, in my mind, at least, this would be an example of God's providence and him showing that even though the world is doing something very uncontrollable and that we would see as very terrible, he still has power over it. However, with how their religion works and how their spiritual beliefs are, that has become a pilgrimage site, and people will go to that ruined church and pray to that specific crucifix because what they believe is the object hanging on the wall is what had the power to stop the natural disaster, not the God which it's representing, which their religion, I should abbreviate this. So when the Purepeches were building their empire before the Spanish showed up, they would conquer new territories, and as part of keeping the peace in the empire, they would bring the people in and they would also accept their gods. So then when the Spanish showed up and they brought Catholicism, they accepted the Spanish and they added Christ to their religion. So if you look at traditional Purepecha religion now, I believe it's worshiping the sun god, the moon god, and Christ all lumped together as a polytheistic religion. So that kind of shows the perspective that most of the natives would be looking at Christianity from. After that, the next week we were back in Angowan again, and for the most part it was the same, more home visits, more working on the church. At one point that week I got to cook for everybody, and somehow I had a bunch of people from the middle of Mexico really enjoying Italian food, so that was a highlight. Yeah, they told us to make them an American meal, and of course I make pasta. Not sure what I was thinking there, but it was easy. So, and at the end of that weekend, we also spent one day making a trip to a village called Nurio. There is a group of churches there that will occasionally get together just to play sports, hear a message, and just kind of have some cohesiveness in the Christian community they do have there. There were two main significant things that happened as a result of that. One I will get to when it's more relevant. The other is that on a missions trip, I played basketball without breaking my ankle. That was our last weekend in Angowan. And after church that Sunday, we hung around for a few hours, spending time with the family before we left. And once again, they made it very clear how thankful they were for us. Truth be told, that was a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. What we did there honestly seemed very small, but it meant the world to them. Basically, we showed up and we visited the people in the village. We helped them with a project. And honestly, it didn't really seem like that much to me. And the other thing that I didn't really understand was how little they have in comparison to us, but also how much they went out of their way to give us everything they could. At home, I get really annoyed when I wake up during the winter and my room is 62 degrees. There was probably 35 to 40 degrees at night. They don't have heaters or insulation, and their entire family gave up their rooms for 2 weeks so that they could give us the most comfortable place to stay that they could. And just looking at the contrast between what we have and what they have, and then what they were still willing to give us, was a very humbling thing to see. That weekend, we were back at the house in Urupan, and a group of people from Nurio showed up and asked if they could host us at some point before we left. So the next weekend we ended up heading back to Nurio, and I somehow managed to go about 4 weeks into this without really getting culture shocked, and let's change that one. For the entire trip that far, we'd always had at least one person with us who knew the culture and knew us well enough that I could go, how do I behave myself here? And then in Nurio, they split us up with different host families, and someone had the bright idea of sending me with one of the families by myself. So all of a sudden, I was with a group of people who I'd met about 2 hours ago, trying to remember how to be polite as they invited me into their home, and then we went straight into doing ministry together. That morning, they divided us up. I was sent with a man named Abel. We left the group. I got in the car by myself with a total stranger whose language I don't speak, and then we left. I wouldn't say I was scared, but certainly a deer in the headlights. We got to the house, they invited me in, and there I met his family. We were in the family home, which in Purepecha culture, when you get married, it's traditional that you begin your marriage living in his family's house. And in most cases, you'll stay there for several years at least. So I was immediately greeted by his wife, his mother, and his daughter, Anna. Thankfully, Anna spoke very good English. Abel knew enough to get a point across when he needed to, but the rest of the family only spoke Spanish and Purepecha. And another funny side note, when we were staying in Nurio, I met a man who frequently comes to America for work and found out that when he does that, he stays in St. Cloud. Not sure how the world can get much smaller than that, but it was kind of an interesting thing to have come up. Also, at the end of that time, their pastor asked if we would like to go and see his workshop before we left, and it turned out he was a guitar maker, so the kid in the candy store all afternoon for that one. I have pictures of that I can show you later, even if I'm not broadcasting them. Fair warning, you'll be there for about an hour if you ask me about it. But the last week of our outreach was spent at the local church in Urupan. We did about 6 months or a year's worth of cleaning and maintenance that they hadn't had time to get to in about a week. Scrubbed all the floors, cleaned the walls from top to bottom, cleaned every single white plastic chair individually. It was great. With everything that we were able to help them get through, though, and all the cleaning and stuff, they had 1 or 2 more rooms that were functional when we were left that they couldn't even use when we got there. So even if it was, once again, feeling like, oh, we're just showing up to clean, it actually did make quite the difference for them. Then after that, we went home. We landed, and it was 10 below outside, and it felt wonderful. That's actually not sarcasm for once. I'm serious about that. It felt really good. When I stepped off the plane and felt the cold, I felt a sense of relief I never would have imagined coming from that, but I knew I was home. There were people waiting for me to come back. There were new adventures to have and old ones to continue with. But most importantly, God had taken the time to reset me so that I could serve those purposes better than I ever could have before. When I came home, somehow the most exciting thing for me was going back to work. It's not a glamorous job, but it's useful. It means something to me. And once again, he gave back every good thing that he asked me to let go of. While it may have felt like God was taking me apart piece by piece, now I'm seeing that he did that because each piece needed to be reworked so it could serve its purpose better. And so that I could more faithfully live out the purpose he'd already shown me. If you got my letter or read my blog, you've probably heard this already, but I've talked a couple times about this experience and what my band name means to me. Refined by Fire came from watching my dad in the blacksmith shop. You start with a raw piece of steel, you throw it in the fire till it's glowing orange, and then you beat on it with a hammer until it's in the shape you want it to be. If we were to ask that piece of steel how it felt about the whole process, I doubt it would have much good to say about being thrown in the fire, burned, and beaten on the anvil. However, after being given some time to relax and look in the mirror, there's a different perspective that comes to light. Because we're never being mindlessly beaten or heartlessly burned. The smith had a plan all along. And he's been slowly working on the raw form and turning it into something beautiful. And while it may have been very comfortable sitting on the steel rack as a 4-foot-long piece of half-inch square bar, I wasn't very useful that way. I needed some things trimmed away. I needed to be reshaped, reformed, and reconditioned into something of far greater value than the raw stock that I was. And that couldn't happen sitting on the shelf. Over the last several months, the analogy I thought was so cool as a kid became very real very quickly. And I went from coasting along, enjoying the people around me and being happy in my career, to suddenly having all of that very far away. And at the end of the day, I did serve my purpose there. And on the last day of outreach, God very clearly said to me, "Well done." And that's kind of the close of that chapter. But at the end of the day, as I walk away from it and close that chapter, I can do so knowing I have followed God and done my best for him. And that tomorrow is a new beginning. So, Ryan, do you have anything? Do you want to just go for questions or?
Yeah, so what we'll do is let's do Q&A, but what we're going to have to do with this, because of the live stream and such, we're going to need to either repeat the question.
Yeah, Chris went through that with me, so.
Oh, good. Then
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Why don't you still stand there? I'm just going to sit, and so I can help mediate questions as they come. But as we go
So now I need a supervisor?
Yeah, now you need a supervisor. We've seen what you can do, and we're not okay with it.
Well, just
Any questions
everyone clap as you left
offhand?
the stage, too.
Or while you're thinking, one thing I want to ask you, so with your experience that you just kind of shared, and then coming back into and stepping not into same old, but I think stepping into your occupation, perhaps with some new insights, how are those melding together? The lessons that you learned and where you feel like the Lord is wanting to take what you've learned and using it as you move forward?
The simplest answer to that is it felt like while I was gone, God kind of wanted to take into a reset, and I kind of already knew a bunch of the purposes that he eventually had for me, but he wanted to put me in a place where I could do them much better than I already was capable of, and not necessarily, and pursue them for the right reasons instead of just because I wanted to. So, like with work, there's been a couple opportunities here and there to talk with people about it. It hasn't come up a lot, but it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the Colossians and the Isaiah passages too. My goal there isn't to show up and preach a sermon every morning. It's to be a good enough technician that they would respect me as a person, so that when those questions do come up, they would also respect my answers for them. And in certain people, at least I've seen where that has happened.
What questions you guys have for Daniel? It can be about his experience, about his life growth, anything really. He said earlier today, nothing is really off limits, at least most. Did you meet a girl?
No.
The answer to that is no.
Well, I met plenty of them, but...
Yes, Bree.
No.
What part of the trip did you value the most?
The few times the house was quiet. I would have, I think if I look at the lecture phase first, probably the most valuable part of that was seeing how even if I never understood what was going on, God was there through it the entire time. And even if I didn't have the answers, he took care of me until he did give them to me. On the missions part, I think the biggest thing there was, well, one of the things I did not mention yet is that I have never had any interest in missions because I have no ability to grasp foreign languages. So for a lot of that, I just plain felt like I wasn't going to be any use because I couldn't actually communicate with anyone. But then as I was there, God kept using the same things there that he uses in me here. So I think the biggest thing was seeing the value of the gifts he's given me and how he can use them no matter where I am.
Yeah, that's kind of cool, even despite the language barrier. That's kind of, I like that. Any other questions you guys have for Daniel here? Yes, Terry.
I didn't hear anything about music, but was that a part of your time?
Was music a part of your time at all, Daniel?
A little bit.
Would you sing us a song?
Well, you go get me a guitar and
No,
I will
okay.
find a chord.
Answer the
So-
question. Answer the question.
I see how you really feel. Yes, it was a part of it a little bit. We didn't have a worship team or anything with us. I had a book of songs that occasionally the churches would ask us to play something. And so I had just some of the easier songs that I've worked on here and some of the stuff I've enjoyed from, well, where was that sentence going? So,
Yeah.
yes, I had a music book with me and I occasionally played when they asked us to.
Reminds us of 1999, doesn't it?
You think I can remember that?
Yes, Wyatt. How's the weather down there?
It was beautiful.
What average
Probably-
temperature? I know they measure it in Celsius, so we don't get a good contrast.
I use
of it.
Fahrenheit most of the time, but
Oh,
probably
how about
50
that?
to 70 most of the time.
Wow.
It did get fairly chilly at night when you were up in the mountains, but for the most part, it was very pleasant. Sweatshirt weather for a lot of it. So
Nice. Does that make you want to go down there, Wyatt? Oh, just curious. Yes, Bree.
So, when you went on this trip, what do you think your purpose was?
When you went on the mission trip, what do you think your purpose was?
I'm not sure if we have time to answer that question in 20 minutes.
Well, you have actually less than that because technically we're done at
fair.
a quarter till. So
Oh,
you have
perfect.
6 minutes.
My purpose in the missions portion, I honestly am not completely sure about. There were a lot of things that people on the team told me about afterwards that I ended up finding out I really helped make things tick for them. But I didn't really see it that well while I was there and while I was involved with it. What God did with me was, like I said, essentially just taking time away from normal life. So I had to deal with things and I had to sort out what I needed to work on. But honestly, I think it would take more time to step back and look at it and see what purpose I actually served in the missions portion. So give me a year and I'll answer that question again for you.
Kind of a follow-up with that, and maybe you can kind of go twofold. So short-term experience. You went on one here. I know that we've had some others who have done that. I know students do it frequently, but we've had some adults do it as well. What would you say? A couple things. One, answer, is this something you feel like the Lord would want you to pursue again? And number two, perhaps with that would be, what about others, whether they've gone or not? You got young people. Should they engage in a short-term trip? Why or why not? And what about adults? Should they be engaging like you did and pursuing a short-term trip, maybe even long-term?
Repeat the first half for me.
I don't remember. The first part was, would you do it again?
If God asked me to, yes, I would, but he hasn't asked me to.
So you don't necessarily see this as something that's, at least currently, a pattern that God has laid out for you to kind of continue?
At this point, I do not see international missions being something that I would end up doing frequently. He may change that. I'm not so sure how I would
That's
feel
fine.
initially about it, but as of now, like I said, if he asked me to go, I would, but he hasn't asked me to yet.
Okay. What about others who have or have not gone? What's your take on it?
The first thing is, don't go because you want an experience. Because if you're going to do something that's supposed to be for God and you're doing it for you, that's not the right reason to go. But if you're looking for how you can serve, how to grow your faith and grow closer to God, I do believe that it would be something that would be helpful. If you aren't ready to go off to college yet and you want to do something in a gap year, it would be a very good thing to do. The biggest thing that I would say, and this is kind of something Terry pointed out to me when I was getting started on it, is don't go into missions because you want to try it. Go into it because that's what God wants and that's what God is leading you to. And this was a case where that's what God led me to do, and it was very helpful for me. And if that's what you think God is leading you towards, if I can put him on the spot, I would probably say go talk to Terry and ask him about it because he knows way more than I do. But it was something that was very helpful, and I believe it would really help people grow if they did it. So,
one of the interesting things that we've seen, and I've taken many trips with students, is many people will go with the idea of we're going to go and we're going to change, and preach and minister, which is true and it's good. But most often what we find is the Lord does a work in us. Mm-hmm. As we engage and obey him, he does a work in us. And that work that's there is still valuable, but we come back as changed people as well. Would you say you're a changed person having come back?
To a certain extent, yes. You're never going to get rid of me that you've always known.
That's what we were hoping for.
Well, you're out of luck, but maybe a little bit refined and a little bit better.
That's right.
So, but
Okay.
Yes, I would say there were changes in me that he did through it. I have a hard time pointing them out in myself a lot of times, but I know they're there, and some people have commented on differences they've seen. So,
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Marla.
So the first 3 months you do the classroom and you do the Bible stuff and all that. You use the big word providence. So before you went there and while you were there and now that you're back, the Bible always tells us to be ready with an answer. You went to the villages where they didn't let you do that. So through this process, do you feel like you have gotten a more solid focus on what's my answer going to be when somebody asks me your theology, because we go with one thing and YWAM has a definite theology and, you grew up in this church, which is maybe a little different. But where did that all land so that are you ready, coworker, whatever, when they're ready to ask you? Did it bring you closer to the God of providence that you used to be able to give an answer that you believe in your heart?
So let me try to condense that question for the live stream. The question is, we find in the scriptures that we're always to be ready to give an answer for what the faith
42.
for the faith that we have. In what ways has this trip molded that ability for you to have that answer within you as you go about your career, as your work now, and engaging with your coworkers and those around you? In what way has that been established or changed in you?
So with how I was brought up, I had a lot of those things taught to me when I was younger. So a lot of those answers, I already had something there and something to share. And quite frankly, if a coworker asks me about it, we can talk about it for hours. But what this would have done was add more life experience on top of it and kind of given context for the answer and why you believe it. And it's kind of expanded on the relational aspect of it instead of just the academic answer for why do you believe there's a God. Is that a satisfactory answer for you? Or perfect. So.
We are out of time. I would entertain, if there's one more question that someone really had burning, we would entertain it. Otherwise, I'll pray for Daniel here. Yes, go ahead, Cindy.
Will you stay in contact, or does one have to, do you stay in contact with any of your team? And will you at the video?
So the question is, will you stay in contact with your team that you went down, or are they staying in contact?
I have been in total hermit mode for the last month, so I'm not talking to more than 2 or 3 people.
All right. Just out of
period,
curiosity,
so.
are you an introvert by chance?
I am the definition of an ambivert that can't make up its mind.
Yeah, okay.
So.
Just curious about that. Okay. A lot of people, I don't know that I've ever heard the answer, have you stayed in contact with the people? And they said, I don't know. Thank you for that.
Her best friend in the world is her teammate from Australia, and they talk every day.
Did they ever throw boomerangs together? Because that's a really bonding experience. Okay. I don't know. They should. Let me pray for Daniel here, and we'll get dismissed. Lord, I thank you for the work that you have done in our brother Daniel. I thank you for the heart work that you have engaged in him. Lord, you're not done with us. I just praise you that you continue to do this molding and the shaping. You use us where we are gifted. You have gifted us in such ways that as we go forth in this world, you want to present the gospel to all we come in contact with. And so I pray that for Daniel as he engages in his work and in his coworkers and his customers, Lord. I just pray that you will be glorified through him, that his life will indeed be a testimony, and that these lessons that he has learned and gleaned as he has ministered in international experiences, Lord, will continue to resonate within him. And if there's others that are desiring and feeling that tug towards international work, by all means, Lord, we ask that you continue that press. But others, I ask that you will continue to raise in us this burning heart's desire to just share that gospel wherever it is that you have placed us, to always have that answer for the faith that you have given to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you, Daniel. And you may applaud him.